May 1945. There is no active front left in Europe because the German army has lost stable defence in all directions. In the Berlin operation, the troops of the First Belarusian Front under Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Ivan Stepanovich Konev broke into the city and took the government quarters. In the night of 8th to 9th May in Karlsruhe Field, Wilhelm Bodewin Johann Gustav Keitel signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender before representatives of the USSR, the USA, the United Kingdom and France, formalising the end of the war in Europe in the West. The armies under the overall command of Dwight David Eisenhower had already crossed the Rhine, encircled the Ruhr and reached the Elbe, where they met units of the Red Army. After the surrender, Red Army columns keep moving along the roads of eastern and central Germany because it is necessary to secure settlements, communication hubs and depots. At first, only isolated knocked-out vehicles appear along the roadside, but as the advance continues, they more and more often encounter places where vehicles stand in groups. In one of the areas east of Berlin, the column reaches a field where German combat vehicles abandoned during the withdrawal stand in several uneven lines. In the first row there are medium tanks, PzKpfw IV. Further back in depth stand the larger silhouettes of Panther, and a little to the side, heavier and taller, several heavy Tiger I tanks can be seen mixed with StuG III self-propelled guns and low hulls of tank destroyers. The vehicles do not look like a display, but like a torn-off fragment of recently existing units that were still trying to hold the approaches to Berlin. On some PzKpfw IV, the turrets are turned toward the road, and traces of soot after recent firing are visible in the barrels of the 75mm guns. On the armour of the Panther, there are visible impact marks, rough field welds and mounts for extra track links that the crews use to reinforce protection in street fighting. On one Tiger, traces of shells that failed to penetrate the front plate can be seen, and nearby lie torn-off tracks and tools thrown down in haste. Almost simultaneously, similar scenes open up before US and British troops in the western regions of Germany, where the battles for the Ruhr had taken place and the Rhine had been crossed. Along railway branches, they find parking areas where German units tried to gather vehicles for transfer, but didn't manage to take them out from under air attacks. And before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and if you're enjoying this one, don't forget to subscribe and smash a like. On the yards near depots stand rows of PzKpfw IV, several Panthers and self-propelled guns that were abandoned because of lack of fuel and ammunition. American engineer units mark the unit numbers on the sides and see that vehicles which had fought both against the British in the Netherlands and against American divisions in the Ardennes are mixed here. Headquarters of the Allies begin to receive summaries in which for the first time appear estimates of the total quantity of captured armoured vehicles. Separate reports from the sectors where Zhukov's, Konev's and Eisenhower's troops operated give a picture in which it is a matter not of hundreds but of thousands of vehicles. These lists include not only tanks but also self-propelled guns, armoured personnel carriers and tractors that ended up abandoned on roads and fields. The officers in charge of accounting note that a significant part of this pool can formally still be restored, but every new batch requires people, space, and time. The reasons for such concentrations of armoured vehicles are clear from the overall chronology of the last months of the war. In January and February in the east, the Vistula-Oder offensive was underway, in which Soviet forces broke through the defences and reached the Oder, forcing German units to abandon vehicles during withdrawal. In February and March in the west, the Allied army secured bridgeheads beyond the Rhine and began to encircle the Ruhr area, depriving German formations of fuel and ammunition. In April, the Berlin operation began, where the last reserve German tank units were thrown into battle in a fragmented way and could not stabilise the front. As a result, by May the roads and fields were left with vehicles for which there was neither fuel nor a route corridor for retreat. For the officers who see such a field for the first time, these rows of tanks become a visible outcome of the entire armoured policy of the Third Reich over 6 years of war. Here one can see early and late versions of the PzKpfw IV, newer Panthers, heavy Tiger I tanks and various StuG III variants that at different times were considered an answer to Soviet and Allied vehicles. From the concentration of vehicles alone, it is obvious that German armoured production continued right to the end, even when the general situation already made these efforts hopeless. Now all this has turned into a static reserve of metal, distributed between the occupation zones and demanding decisions. After the first inspections, the field with tanks and self-propelled guns stops being just a site, and work begins to bring the captured vehicles into a system. In the Soviet occupation zone, collection points are assigned where vehicles from nearby areas are to be brought, so they are not left singly in shelter belts and on roadsides. For one of these points, they choose a former Wehrmacht repair base that has hangars, lifting equipment and railway tracks. On this site, PzKpfw IV, Panther, Tiger I, StuG III, and other vehicles start to be placed by sectors, separated by type and approximate condition. Engineer officers receive logbooks and forms in which they enter hull, turret and chassis numbers, and brief notes on whether the engine, running gear and main gun are intact. If on a PzKpfw IV the engine starts and the gearbox still works, the vehicle is driven under its own power to the edge of the yard where potentially operational examples are gathered. If a Panther has serious damage to the hull or suspension, but aggregates and optics have survived inside, it is left in a row from which units will later be removed for other vehicles, or the hull will be sent for a separate decision. Heavy Tiger I tanks are usually marked separately because their armour and armament interest specialists in protection and artillery systems. In parallel with technical notes, the officers try to link individual vehicles with the units and operations in which they took part. Divisional markings and tactical numbers remain on the sides, from which it is possible to understand where this equipment had previously operated, whether in East Prussia, Silesia or the suburbs of Berlin. Inside some hulls they find diaries, route sketches and sheets with ammunition expenditure notes where the Kursk battle, the defence of the Vistula, and the fighting on the Oder are mentioned. These finds do not change the overall accounting but provide a clearer idea of how long and under what conditions the vehicles that now stand a few steps from the railway tracks were used. In the Western occupation zones the work proceeds in a similar way, although the scale is somewhat different from that in the Red Army. In the American sector, tanks and self-propelled guns are drawn together to sites near large railway junctions, where both storage and possible loading can be organised. The technical service officers note which PzKpfw IV and Panthers were captured after the Ardennes operation, and which were taken during the advance to the Ruhr, and the Elbe British units organised their own points where separate rows are made for tanks, armoured personnel carriers and tank destroyers that had fought in the Netherlands and northern Germany. As consolidated tables from different occupation zones reach the headquarters, the command gets a more accurate picture of what exactly the Allies possess after the surrender of Germany. These documents already list tens of thousands of armoured vehicles, and it becomes clear that most of this pool consists of machines from the final war years. It is noted that a significant share of the tanks and self-propelled guns were abandoned not because of complete breakdown, but because destroyed infrastructure and lack of fuel made them useless. At the same time, it is recorded that every new dump of vehicles requires guards, space and personnel who will at least maintain minimal order. Inside the headquarters, the first practical questions are discussed, which follow directly from these summaries, and do not yet require any final decisions on the fate of the entire pool. The guns of German tanks need their own ammunition, of which almost none remains and whose production nobody plans to resume in its previous form. Engines, transmissions and running gear are built to standards different from Soviet, American and British ones, which immediately makes maintenance more complicated and expensive. Even at the level of training tasks, it becomes clear that any mass use of captured vehicles would require a separate supply chain. While these questions are only being recorded in the form of memos and reports, the work on the sites continues at the same pace. Soldiers and technicians drive still mobile vehicles into separate rows. Others are hauled out of the fields by tractors and placed at the end of the lists. In some areas, tents and temporary shelters are already visible, under which removed components and equipment are stacked so they do not rust in the open air. Fields and parking areas that only a few weeks earlier had been part of the combat space are turning into large depots of metal and machinery, around which a new post-war logic of decisions is gradually beginning to take shape. Several months after the surrender of Germany, the trophy parking areas no longer look like shapeless dumps, because batches of vehicles are being selected from them for shipment to testing grounds. In the USSR, they form train echelons that include several medium Panther tanks, 1 or 2 heavy Tiger I or Tiger II tanks, StuG III self-propelled guns, and Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers. Railcars with these vehicles go to the Armoured Vehicle Research Institute near Moscow, where there is a proving ground with pre-marked firing lines and areas for static tests. The task is clearly worded in the documents. It is necessary to check the real resistance of the armour and the power of the guns against those tanks that are already in service or will soon enter service with post-war units. At the proving ground, the heavy Tiger II tank is placed on a levelled pad and chocked under the tracks so that the hull does not shift from the impact of shells. The frontal armour of the hull and turret, which in this area reaches 150 to 180 millimetres, is marked out into squares at which fire will be directed from 85mm and 100mm guns, as well as from tank guns mounted on prospective models. Each shot is recorded by time, type of shell, distance and point of impact, and observers note the nature of dents, cracks and penetrations. After a series of salvos, engineers enter the tank to assess the amount of secondary fragments and damage to internal components that determine crew survival in the event of incomplete penetration. On the neighbouring pad, they test the medium Panther tank, which became a symbol of the German attempt to create a universal vehicle with powerful armament and sloped armour. The 80mm thick frontal plate of the hull is set at a steep angle, and the engineers are interested in how it holds the impact of armour-piercing shells of different calibers at distances from a few hundred metres to a kilometre. For comparison, a Soviet tank of similar weight is placed nearby so that the difference in damage under identical firing conditions can be seen immediately. Inspection after the salvos shows where the slope really saves the vehicle and where armour quality and well-design produce cracks and spalling dangerous for the crew. A separate cycle of tests is devoted to the German guns themselves, above all the 75mm and 88mm guns mounted on the Panther, Tiger I and Tiger II. For them, armour plates are set up on the proving ground, selected in thickness to match Soviet and Allied tanks, in order to assess at what distances these guns retain confident penetration. The initial velocities of the shells, the angle of impact on the armour, and the condition of the rear side of the plate after the hit are measured, including delamination and the appearance of cracks. These data are immediately entered into tables where they can be compared with results for Soviet 76mm and 85mm guns and British systems mounted on Churchill tanks and other vehicles. Besides armour and guns, engines and transmissions are studied, since they determine how the equipment performs in a long campaign. Using the Panther tank as an example, they dismantle the Maybach gasoline engine, note the layout in the engine compartment and the air and fuel supply scheme. The engineers look at how many hatches and panels must be opened to reach key components and assess whether major repairs can be done in field conditions without a full workshop. Based on these inspections, conclusions are drawn about which design solutions provide mobility at the price of maintenance complexity and which place excessive strain on the vehicle. Observation devices, sights and optical instruments supplied by Carl Zeiss and other German manufacturers do not go unnoticed either. On proving ground stands, removed sights are installed and used to compare image quality, field of view, and ease of use with Soviet and Allied counterparts. Engineers note how the correction input system is arranged, how the sight is mounted in the turret, and how well it is protected from fragments and blast waves. These observations turn into recommendations for those who design new tank turrets and sights for post-war vehicles. In parallel, similar work unfolds in the United States, where several Panthers and Tigers are sent for tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground. American specialists compare the German tanks with their own M4 Sherman medium tank and M26 Pershing heavy tank, evaluating not only protection and armament, but also acceleration dynamics, running gear reliability and component life. On test tracks, they measure speed on roads and on dirt, turning radius, and the ability to overcome slopes and ditches. The result gives a clear idea that Germany arrived at powerful and well-armed vehicles, paying for this with high design complexity and demanding maintenance. In the United Kingdom, captured Panthers and Tigers undergo tests on firing ranges and in tank training centres, where they are used as visual aids. Instructors show course attendees where the weak armour zones are, what the real height and width of the tank are, and how it looks in the sight of an anti-tank gun at different distances. Several vehicles are used as moving targets and training chutes to check how artillery crews and anti-tank gun crews cope with the stress of engaging a real target. This experience helps not only to understand the enemy's equipment, but also to adjust their own training methods. In all these centres, a common understanding gradually takes shape of what German armoured vehicles were by the end of the war. Not only on paper, but under real conditions, the Panther and Tiger confirm their danger as opponents when it comes to protection, guns and optics, but at the same time weak points in reliability and maintenance are revealed. The StuG III and Jagdpanzer IV self-propelled guns show that simpler vehicles in terms of design could be effective in defence, especially from ambushes in familiar terrain. On the desks of designers and in staff offices, reports accumulate in which German solutions are already considered as material for selection rather than as ready-made models for direct copying. When the main tests and inspections are completed, the commands of the occupation zones have not only a rough list of trophies in their hands, but also detailed conclusions about the real value of each type of vehicle. The reports note that the use of German tanks within their own forces would require a separate system for supplying ammunition, spare parts and fuel, which nobody intends to produce in former volumes. The 75mm and 88mm guns need special shells that do not match the adopted standards, and the gearboxes and engines are incompatible with the repair chains of Allied armies. At the same time, each parking area with dozens of vehicles requires guards, space and personnel, which creates a constant load without clear return. At the political level, the issue of the fate of German armoured vehicles is linked to already adopted decisions on the demilitarization of Germany, fixed in Allied agreements for the leaders of the USSR, USA, United Kingdom and France. It is important not only to study captured weapons, but also to exclude the possibility that a new strike force might ever be created on this basis. Therefore, in the documents that descend down the chain of command, a general principle is fixed. Germany's heavy weapons must be withdrawn, used for scientific and training purposes, and then destroyed or recycled. This principle is not always openly formulated for the rank and file, but it guides decisions on each of the largest depots of tanks and self-propelled guns. In the Soviet zone, after the completion of the main tests, a phased clearing of parks begins from those vehicles that are not planned for use even temporarily. At some proving grounds, Tigers, Panthers, PzKpfwV IVs and StuG IIIs continue to serve as targets for artillery, tank units, and air bombardment until their hulls lose shape. Some vehicles are dismantled into components, with engines, sights, and individual units removed for study or for training repair crews. The remaining hulls are cut into large fragments with gas torches so that the metal can be sent to factories which in the post-war economy need any steel for rebuilding infrastructure. By 1946, the Red Army keeps only a limited number of German tanks and self-propelled guns, which are used as training aids and range targets. This equipment is no longer in service with combat units, because the focus is on their own models, including a new generation of tanks that develop the T-34 line and wartime heavy tanks. Documents state that having German vehicles in active service creates unnecessary complexity for supply and training, whereas the experience gained from studying the Panthers and Tigers has already been taken into account in the requirements for new projects. Thus, the trophy fleet in the Soviet zone turns from a real combat force into a temporary source of knowledge and metal. In the Western occupation zones, some German tanks remain in service for a short time as training targets and auxiliary vehicles, but there too decisions move in the same direction. The United States uses Panthers and Tigers for tests and demonstrations, and then sends most of the hulls for scrapping, keeping single examples in museums and training centres. After a series of exercises and comparative tests, the United Kingdom also reduces the amount of captured equipment, sending surplus vehicles to be broken up. Reports emphasise that operating foreign equipment to maintain small fleets does not justify the cost of a separate supply chain and crew training. Some PzKpfwV IVs and StuG IIIs in Eastern European countries get a different but temporary fate, as they are included in the armies forming after the war. These vehicles end up in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria and other states, where there is not yet a sufficient number of their own or allied armoured vehicles. There they are used in exercises and sometimes kept as a reserve in case of border conflicts, while at the same time transitioning to Soviet or other standards. Over time, part of this fleet is sold outside Europe, including to Syria and Spain, where German tanks and self-propelled guns managed to take part in local conflicts already in the 1950s to 1960s. However, in the occupation zones of Germany themselves, this process moves toward maximum reduction and destruction of heavy equipment. On the ground, this looks like long rows of hulls without turrets, stacked tracks and piles of removed parts waiting their turn for melting trains, carry cut sections of hulls to steel plants engaged in restoring civilian industry. In the areas of former battlefields, only single monuments and training sites remain, where a few vehicles are kept intact for clarity for future generations of military personnel. By the end of the 1940s, this equipment for the troops themselves, in fact, ceases to exist as a real combat tool and turns into raw material and scattered examples. At depots and proving grounds, individual Panthers, PzKpfwV IVs or StuG IIIs can still be seen waiting their turn for dismantling or use in training shoots. The main decisions have already been made. There is no longer a mass fleet of German tanks, and the trophy reports and diagrams go into the archives of staffs and institutes. Against the background of post-war reconstruction of cities and roads, the armour of the Third Reich becomes no longer a weapon, but a heavy fragment of the war that has passed. Block 3. Part 1. In the early 1950s, German tanks are no longer in service either with Germany or with the major powers, but the materials from their tests continue to be used inside design bureaus. In the USSR, by this time, work is underway on a new main tank that should replace the T-34 and the heavy wartime vehicles, and in these discussions the results of studying the Panther and Tiger appear. Engineers note how the sloped front, compact turret and powerful gun were combined, and what problems were caused by the weight and maintenance complexity. When designing the T-54, They use their own wartime experience but also take into account the enemy's mistakes in order not to repeat excessive weight and overloading of components. The T-54's front hull plate is also made sloped, but the overall silhouette of the tank turns out lower and more compact than that of the Panther, and this is visible already in the first production drawings. In armament, they move to a 100mm gun that must confidently defeat enemy armoured vehicles at long ranges and work against fortifications. At the same time, the engineers avoid excessive growth in weight, trying to keep it within limits suitable for mass production and operation in the troops. Design Bureau notes emphasise that the captured Tigers and Panthers showed the limit beyond which a vehicle becomes too heavy for a real war. In the United Kingdom, designers work on the Centurion tank, which was conceived even at the end of the war as a response to German heavy and medium vehicles. The first Centurion variants receive a gun of the 17-pounder class. Later they switch to more powerful barrels and then to a 105mm gun that becomes a standard for many NATO countries. When assessing turret layout and armour protection, British engineers rely both on their own experience and on observations of how the Tiger's turret resisted hits and how the gun was mounted in the Panther's mantlet. German optics and sighting devices provide material for improving their own sights, which must provide accurate fire at long distances. In the United States, the line of M46, M47, M48, and later M60 tanks is formed already after the war, but in them as well, the influence of the conclusions drawn from German equipment is visible. American armour protection specialists take into account how the German scheme of protected front and vulnerable sides worked, and try to balance armour and weight distribution. Reports on tests of captured vehicles at the Aberdeen proving ground note that overly complex suspension and heavy turrets place a load on the running gear and engine. Therefore, when designing new vehicles in the United States, they try to combine a more powerful gun and better protection with acceptable reliability and maintainability in ordinary units. French engineers take an even more direct path when they create the experimental MX-50 tank, in which the influence of the Tiger II can be seen. On this vehicle they use a multi-road wheel running gear, reminiscent of German heavy tanks and powerful armament with reinforced armour, trying to combine the role of a heavy and a medium tank. As a result, the designers encounter the same problems as their German predecessors. The vehicle's weight and complexity reach a level that complicates series production. This experience becomes another confirmation that copying the German approach to heavy tanks without taking economic and operational limitations into account does not justify itself. Individual solutions used by the Germans on the StuG III and Jagdpanzer IV are analysed separately, because these vehicles showed high effectiveness with more moderate complexity. The low silhouette, dense layout, and sensible armour protection make them an awkward target, especially if they are in defence on familiar terrain. Soviet and Western designers take this into account when developing their own post-war self-propelled guns and anti-tank vehicles. In many places, the same principle is repeated. A vehicle does not have to be universal, but can be tailored to a specific task if at the same time it remains simple and reliable. From the materials on optics and sights of Carl Zeiss and other German manufacturers, different countries take not so much ready-made designs as an understanding of the level that needs to be achieved. Soviet, British, and American instrument specialists note the quality of the glass, the convenience of the scales, and the compactness of some designs. This is reflected in new sights installed on post-war tanks and self-propelled guns, where accurate fire and rapid reorientation to another direction are required. The German school becomes one of the reference points, but not the only source of solutions, because each country fits these elements into its own industry. Overall, by the early 1950s, the major powers have formed a common type of future vehicle that will later be called the main battle tank. It is no longer a division into light, medium and heavy designs, but an attempt to combine mobility, protection, and a powerful gun in one vehicle. These projects contain lessons drawn from analysis of the Panther and Tiger, but they stand alongside experience gained with the T-34, Sherman, Churchill and other wartime vehicles. German armoured vehicles remain in these schemes as an important but not the only source that showed both the strong sides of the enemy's technology and the limits of its development. While designers in different countries work with reports, drawings and individual components, the German tanks themselves gradually disappear from European proving grounds and roads. In Germany itself, after demilitarization and division into occupation zones, heavy armoured vehicles do not remain in the troops, and the future army of the Federal Republic of Germany is created already on the basis of new standards. When projects such as Leopard 1 and other vehicles appear later, they rely on NATO's post-war experience rather than on a direct line of inheritance from the Panther or Tiger. On the streets, and in the training units of post-war Germany, German tanks from the Third Reich era can be seen only as exceptions at closed sites and in museums. Some captured PzKpfw IV and StuG III vehicles continue to serve in the armies of other countries, where the post-war shortage of armoured vehicles forces them to use everything that can be kept in working order. In Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria and a number of other Eastern European states, these vehicles remain in service in exercises and in reserve, in parallel with the transition to Soviet models. Spain purchases a batch of PzKpfw IV and uses them until the fleet wears out and finally becomes obsolete against the background of newer tanks. In some cases, German chassis are used as the basis for local self-propelled guns and auxiliary vehicles, extending their service life beyond the first years after the war. The use of German tanks in the Middle East forms a separate line, where PzKpfw IV and StuG III end up in Syrian forces. At the turn of the 1950s and 1960s, they are listed among the available armoured vehicles, although they already noticeably lag behind newer machines in protection and firepower. During wars in the Middle East, several such tanks appear in photographs and reports, standing in positions or left behind after battles. These episodes show how equipment created for war in Europe stretches its career to a completely different theatre of operations before finally passing into history. Meanwhile, in Europe and among the major powers outside the continent, armoured forces move toward new generations of vehicles based on post-war concepts. In the USSR, the T-54 and T-55 are followed by later tanks, and within NATO, the fleet of Centurion, M48, M60, and subsequent models expands. The doctrines under which these tanks are to operate take into account both the experience of encounters with German vehicles and the results of the tests of captured equipment carried out immediately after the war. Training materials increasingly feature diagrams in which the Panther and Tiger serve as examples of a certain stage of development that has already been passed and is not repeated in pure form. By the late 1950s, the places where trophy vehicle parks had once stood are either empty sites or already occupied by other depots and buildings. Hulls that went to factories have long since turned into beams, plates and components for civilian structures, and only archival records recall their military origin. The few vehicles that survived in decent condition gradually move into the category of exhibits and are placed in museums. This is how Panther, Tiger and StuG III vehicles appear in the collections of Kubinka, Bovington, Munster and other museums, around which excursions later walk and historians work. For those who study the history of technology, German tanks remain a clear example of how far a design school can go in the search for maximum protection and firepower. Test reports, armour layout diagrams and photographs from trophy proving grounds show how expensive each additional ton of armour and each centimetre of barrel length turned out to be. In post-war projects of different countries, One can see an effort to take this experience into account and avoid repeating extremes toward excessive weight and design complexity. German armoured vehicles thus dissolve into the new generation of machines, leaving behind not a line of direct continuation, but a layer of knowledge embedded in the solutions of design schools that now work in a different world.